For half a century, the world has been divided into two camps. You are either a John person or you are a Paul person. The narrative is set in stone. John Lennon was the intellectual, the rocker, the cynicism, and the raw soul of the Beatles. Paul McCartney was the melody, the optimism, the craftsman, and the commercial appeal. But this binary choice is a lie. It is a simplification that insults both men. To understand the Beatles, we have to understand that John and Paul were not opposites. They were mirrors. They were two traumatized boys from Liverpool who found the only other person on earth who spoke their language. Today, we are going to deconstruct the greatest rivalry in artistic history. We will look at the music, the psychology, and the bitter feud to answer the impossible question: who was the true genius behind the band that changed the world? Before the fame, before the suits, and before the screaming girls, there was death. We often forget that the foundation of the Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just music, it was grief. Paul lost his mother, Mary, to cancer when he was just 14. John lost his mother, Julia, in a traffic accident when he was 17. In the stiff, repressed culture of 1950s Britain, boys didn't cry, they didn't talk about feelings. But John and Paul had music. This shared trauma created a psychic bond that George Harrison and Ringo Starr could never penetrate. When they sat knee tuned in Paul's living room skipping school to write songs, they weren't just writing hits. They were communicating in a code that only they understood. John possessed a chaotic, aggressive energy. He was the leader of the gang. Paul possessed a musical discipline and a drive for perfection that John lacked. John needed Paul to organize his chaos. Paul needed John to give his perfection an edge. Let's analyze the mechanics. How did they actually work? The magic wasn't in their similarities, but in how they corrected each other. Take the song Getting Better. Paul sings the chorus, "It's getting better all the time, it's optimistic, it's hopeful." But then, in the background, you hear John's voice cutting through the sweetness with a cynical line, "It can't get no worse." That is the partnership in a nutshell. Paul lifts you up. John grounds you. Without John, Paul can sometimes float away into sentimentality. Without Paul, John can sink into darkness and abrasive noise. Together, they created a balance that neither could achieve alone. Consider Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. They were released as a double A-side single. They're both songs about their childhood in Liverpool. But look at the difference. John's Strawberry Fields is internal, psychedelic, and abstract. It's about how he feels. No one I think is in my tree. It is a masterpiece of introspection. Paul's Penny Lane is external. It is a documentary. It describes the barber, the banker, the fire engine. It is objective and observant. John looked inside. Paul looked outside. And when you put those two perspectives together, you get a complete picture of the human experience. Here is where the history books often get it wrong. The popular image is that John was the experimental artist and Paul was the safe pop star. But the reality in 1966 was the opposite. While John was living a domestic life in the suburbs, gaining weight and watching television, Paul was living in the center of London. Paul was the one going to experimental art galleries, listening to Stockhausen, and watching avant-garde theater. It was Paul who came up with the loop experiments. Tomorrow never knows. It was Paul who drove the concept of SGT, Pepper. It was Paul who pushed the band to break the rules of the studio. John was the heart of the rock and roll rebellion, but during the mid-60s, Paul was the sonic architect. John's genius was instinctual. He could hear a sound in his head and demand that the producer, George Martin, create it. He would say things like, "I want to smell like sawdust," or "I want my voice to sound like the Dalai Lama chanting from a mountaintop." Paul's genius was practical. He would sit at the piano or pick up a bass and physically construct the harmony that made John's crazy ideas palatable to the mass audience. John provided the lightning. Claude built the lightning rod. As the 60s ended, the bond broke. The breakup of the Beatles wasn't just a business decision, it was a divorce. And like any bitter divorce, they used their strongest weapon against each other, their songwriting. John's solo album, Plastic Ono Band, was a primal scream. He stripped away all the artifice. He sang, "I don't believe in Beatles." It was raw, painful, and brilliant. He wanted to destroy the myth. Paul, on the other hand, retreated to a farm in Scotland. He was depressed and lost, but he rebuilt himself with Ram and Band on the Run. He proved he could craft perfect pop suites without John's help. The low point came with John's song, How Do You Sleep? It was a vicious character assassination of Paul. John mocked Paul's music, calling it music, and attacked his character. But even in this hatred, there was respect. John was hurt. You only write a song that angry about someone you truly love? And Paul, instead of firing back with hate, eventually wrote Dear Friend, a song offering a truce. In the years before John's tragic death in 1980, the anger had faded. They were talking again. They were baking bread. They were watching Saturday Night Live together. The tragedy is that we never got to see them collaborate as old men. We never got to see them navigate the 80s and 90s together. So who was the real genius? If you look at the charts, Paul is the most successful songwriter in history. His melodic sense is a gift that comes once every 100 years. He is the Mozart of the 20th century. If you look at cultural impact, John is the icon. He is the saint of peace, the working class hero, the man who spoke truth to power. He is the soul of rock and roll. But the truth is, neither of them was the genius on their own. The genius was a third entity. The genius was Lennon McCartney. John needed Paul to tell him when to stop screaming. Paul needed John to tell him when to start screaming. In the end, the winner of the debate is us. Because for 10 short years, the two greatest musicians on the planet stood in the same room, looked each other in the eye, and tried to impress one another. And in doing so, they gave us the soundtrack of our lives.